Okay, so to continue with my yesterday's talk, let us talk about high efficiency silicon heterojunction solar cells. How will you choose a crystalline silicon wafer or the heterojunction forming material if your aim is to get high efficiency? So that is what I am going to talk about in this session. So as a summary, yesterday we have seen that a heterojunction is really beneficial for solar cell technology because it has the ability to block photogenerated carrier transport to opposite contacts. So it helps in boosting the open circuit voltage of the solar cell. That means if you are having a heterojunction solar cell, its open circuit voltage will be much higher than a homojunction counterpart if you are making a homojunction solar cell. Then we have seen the device structure of a heterojunction solar cell where amorphous silicon is used as heterojunction forming material with the crystalline silicon absorber layer. And the role of the amorphous silicon is twofold here. Role one is that the amorphous silicon should be able to passivate the high density of defect states present at the crystalline silicon surface. So it should work as an excellent passivation layer. And the second role of the amorphous silicon is the roles associated with the heterojunction property. That means this amorphous silicon should provide suitable valence and conduction band offset for the charge carrier transport. Now in this particular example, this N-type crystalline silicon wafer is working as an absorber, and there is a p-doped amorphous silicon on the top of the crystalline silicon wafer. This amorphous silicon is being deposited on top of it, and there is a N-doped amorphous silicon on the back side. Now, these requirements is not only specific to amorphous silicon. Actually, if you want to form heterojunction by using any kind of material other than using amorphous silicon, the requirements remains same. So the requirements are, I repeat again, is the ability of the heterojunction forming material to passivate the high density of defect states at the crystalline silicon surface, and their ability to provide suitable band offsets for the proper transport of the charge carriers across the interface, across this hetero interface, and then a high conductivity such that once the carriers are within the transport layer, they can travel nicely and smoothly towards the external load. Now let us start from where we have left yesterday. We were talking about measuring lifetime by quasi-steady state photoconductance decay method, and we have seen this curve at the left hand side. These curves plot the effective lifetime, effective minority carrier lifetime as a function of injection density. What is this injection density? It is the number of excess photogenerated carrier inside your crystalline silicon wafer. Now we have seen that this plots the effective lifetime for two different resistive crystalline silicon wafer. The red plot is for high resistive crystalline silicon, and the yellow plot is for low resistive crystalline silicon. So clearly, if you are going to use a high resistive crystalline silicon wafer to form your silicon solar cell, you are getting very high lifetime of your minority carriers, and this will be benefited in terms of your open circuit voltage, in terms of your short circuit current and fill factor. Why this resistivity, high resistivity giving you high lifetime? So let us look at the curve on the right hand side. Here the lifetime is plotted as a function of doping density. So here the dopant is a donor. That means we are talking about a N-type crystalline silicon wafer, and the wafer being N-type, the lifetime is associated with the lifetime of the minority carriers whole, right? So it can be seen that the lifetime decreases sharply with increase in the doping density. And if you think this is quite intuitive, I would rather say, because doping is, after all, is a process of incorporating impurities inside your material. Higher is the doping density, higher would be the defect inside your material, right? So presence of such high density of foreign atoms inside your material increases the defect density, and then there is a high and or fair amount of chance that your photo-generated carriers, or rather the photo-generated minority carriers, will get recombined within these defects, and therefore their lifetime will be less. Okay, now the question arises, if you are looking for fabricating a high efficiency solar cell, which kind of wafer you are going to choose? Are you going to use high resistive wafer, or you will go for a low resistive one? What do you think? So at this point, it appears that going for a high resistive wafer would be good because it is giving you high effective carrier lifetime. But in practical, this is not the case. What happens if you are going for a high resistive wafer to make your crystalline silicon solar cell? The resistance that your photo-generated carriers will see while traveling across your device will be high. That means it increases the overall series resistance of your solar cell. If the series resistance increases, it decreases the fill factor. So the fill factor is the squareness of your IV curve of your solar cell. If you are losing in your fill factor, then you are losing the squareness of your IV curve, and this will reduce the maximum power point or the maximum power that you can get from your solar cell. So very high resistive wafer is not going to work for you, nor does a low resistive wafer, because if you choose low resistive wafer, the lifetime will be less. If you choose high resistive wafer, the series resistance effect will be high. So what to do? So in industrial silicon solar cell, the standard protocol is to use crystalline silicon wafer resistivity of the order of 3 to 7 ohm centimeter. This gives a doping level of around 10 to the power 15 per centimeter cube in case of an N-type crystalline silicon. Now, once we understood the effect of the resistivity in the crystalline silicon wafer, let us see how the quality of your silicon surface passivation affects the solar cell efficiency. So let us see this right hand side figure and choose any of the bulk lifetime. Let me choose this 10 to the power 3 microsecond lifetime. That means I am talking about making a solar cell out of a crystalline silicon wafer having bulk lifetime of 1 millisecond. Now, let us assume that we are starting with this same high lifetime wafer having lifetime 1 millisecond, and we have prepared 7 samples having a different quality of the passivation. That means, for example, let us say that we are depositing amorphous silicon to passivate this wafer, and the passivation quality varies in the 7 wafers. Now, how the quality of the passivation is going to affect the cell efficiency? So for this particular wafer, okay, so let me define this S. This S is called surface recombination velocity. It is actually a measure of the recombination rate at the surface. If the surface recombination velocity is high, that means your recombination rate is high. That means the surface recombination or the lifetime associated with the surface recombination is less. So you can see the recombination velocity increases downwards. Here you are having minimum recombination velocity, which is 10 centimeter per second. And here you are having maximum surface recombination velocity, which is 10 to the power 7 centimeter per second. Now, if you choose to start with a crystalline silicon wafer having bulk lifetime of 1 millisecond, and your passivation quality is not good because here your surface recombination velocity is quite high, That means there are many surface recombination events where you are losing your photogenerated carriers. Your efficiency could be as low as 16%. But see, if you start with the same crystalline silicon wafer, but you can improve on your surface passivation quality, how much you can improve in terms of your efficiency. See the margins. If you can improve the surface recombination velocity, or if you can reduce the surface recombination velocity from 10 to the power 7 to 10 centimeter per second, there is a jump of in the efficiency of around 21%. So it jumps from around 16% to 21%. So it is a huge jump. So if you are choosing, or if you are going for a high lifetime wafer, it is imperative that your passivation quality is also good. Otherwise, there is no benefit. Okay, now let us talk about what is this amorphous silicon. Amorphous silicon is an amorphous form of silicon. Unlike crystalline silicon, where you can find a periodic arrangement of the crystalline silicon atoms, in amorphous silicon, the silicon atoms are distributed in continuously random network. So the long range order that you can find in a crystalline material is missing in this amorphous silicon. And as you can see, there are a huge number of defect states or the dangling bonds even within the bulk of the amorphous silicon. We have seen such kind of dangling bonds at the surface of your crystalline silicon, but the density of the dangling bonds inside the crystalline matrix is always less if your wafer quality is good. But in case of amorphous silicon, there are huge density of dangling bonds present inside the bulk, and some of the dangling bonds are passivated by hydrogen atoms. Now, from where this hydrogen comes inside your amorphous silicon? From where this hydrogen comes inside your amorphous silicon matrix? The hydrogen comes because of the way you deposit amorphous silicon. So usually the amorphous silicon is synthesized by chemical vapor deposition technique, and most commonly plasma enhanced chemical vapor deposition techniques. So in PECVD, the precursor gas that is used to deposit amorphous silicon is silane. Silane is SiH4. Now this precursor gas is introduced in a vacuum chamber and a plasma is generated. And the high energetic electrons that are present in the plasma dissociate this silane gas into molecules like SiH, Si2H2, SiH3, etc. These molecules then come in contact to your substrate over which you want to deposit amorphous silicon and forms the film, or gradually grows the film by making chemical bonds. So the hydrogen is present inside your amorphous silicon because the precursor gas contains the hydrogen. Now it appears that the presence of hydrogen is actually beneficial in terms of its electrical property, because as you can see, the hydrogen is passivating most of the dangling bonds, or it is reducing the overall defect states inside your amorphous silicon. And the effect of hydrogen could be, as much as possible, you can choose it by controlling the deposition technique. Even you can make such superior electronic property amorphous silicon that you can form a thin film amorphous silicon solar cell of efficiency even greater than 10%. So here I am talking about a thin film solar cell that is giving you a 10% efficiency, and that is without using crystalline silicon, which is very expensive. So amorphous silicon thin film technology is a separate kind of technology, and it is very promising technology, thin film technology, that can give you high efficiency at cheaper cost. High efficiency in the range of 10 to 12%, but at a much cheaper cost compared to the crystalline silicon solar cell. So you see, this amorphous silicon material is not only interesting for their application in heterojunction solar cell. It can also be used to make thin film solar cells. Now, what are the other properties of this amorphous silicon? It has optical band gap of around 1.7 electron volt. It is quite high compared to its crystalline counterpart. In crystalline silicon, you are having band gap around 1.2. And most interestingly, this amorphous silicon can be doped N-type or P-type by using precursor gases like diborane or phosphine. So if you want to dope this amorphous silicon by boron, thereby making it a P-type, you can use the precursor gas diborane along with the silane. On the other hand, if you want to make this amorphous silicon N-type, so you can make it by doping phosphorus and by using a precursor gas phosphine along with your silane. So it has been proven that it has excellent passivation ability of the crystalline silicon dangling bonds. Now let us see a more realistic picture of the P amorphous silicon and N crystalline silicon heterojunction interface. So clearly, this N crystalline silicon has work function that is much less than the work function of your P-type amorphous silicon. So work function is the difference between the Fermi level to the vacuum level. So this work function value is lesser in crystalline silicon compared to the P amorphous silicon. So as a result of this work function difference, once you make a contact between these two, electrons will flow from this N crystalline silicon to P amorphous silicon. So we are talking about electrons that is flowing from N crystalline silicon to P crystalline silicon, and this results in a upward band bending at the interface. Why this band bends upward? Because it indicates that you have lost electrons near to this junction, and those electrons have gone to the P side. And the loss of electron can be understood by seeing the increased difference between the age of the conduction band and the Fermi level near the interface, which is much higher compared to the difference at the bulk away from the surface. So interestingly, if you look closely at the interface, because of this band bending, it appears that the valence band has come much closer to the Fermi level. Even if this is an N-type crystalline silicon, but near the interface, because of that high band bending, you are actually inducing an inversion layer at the interface. And this happens because of the high work function difference between the P amorphous silicon and N crystalline silicon. This induced P-type material or P-type crystalline silicon through certain thickness near the interface is actually beneficial for operation of heterojunction silicon solar cell, because now this hole can travel nicely through this induced inversion layer. Clearly, the hole has high mobility, or the ease of transport is high for holes when they are transporting through a P-type than through an N-type. Now, once these holes are at the junction, they can overcome this band offset, this valence band offset, by two ways. One, by thermionic emission, and two, by tunneling this barrier. Now, in order to have efficient tunneling, what you have to do is you have to dope this P amorphous silicon to high level so that the barrier for tunneling for this hole to go to its respective contact or respective transport layer is less. So you are going for a high doping of P amorphous silicon. This will give you nice transport of the photogenerated holes across this valence band throughout the interface. And what about the electrons? Now, because of this induced junction, this electron not only sees a conduction band offset, but it also sees a gradient in the conduction band energy that is opposing it transport towards the p side. So we are getting benefited by this p amorphous silicon and n crystalline silicon heterojunction in these two ways. Okay. So the first heterojunction that has been made has structure like this. They have deposited p amorphous silicon directly on top of the n crystalline silicon. And on the back side, there is they have used metal. So it is a single heterojunction. They have employed heterojunction only to collect holes from this top side. How much efficiency they got? Surprisingly, the efficiency is not that good. The maximum efficiency that they got is around 12%. And even more surprisingly, the VOC is quite less for such heterojunction, but you might be expecting a higher VOC because you are using a heterojunction technology, right? On the contrary, the VOC actually drops to quite low value in this particular heterojunction structure. So what is wrong with this structure? Why there is no improvement in VOC? Even if you are using heterojunction, why there is no improvement in efficiency? It appeared that maybe the transparency of the p amorphous silicon is what reducing its efficiency. So let us see. This shows you the absorption coefficient as a function of energy. Crystalline silicon having band gap energy around 1.2 electron volt absorbs all the energy greater than its band gap energy. And this absorption coefficient is a measure how efficiently your semiconductor is absorbing the light. Okay. Now see for amorphous silicon has band gap around 1.7 electron volt. So it cannot absorb the light which is lower than 1.7 electron volt, but it is a very efficient absorber of light for energies greater than 1.7. Even it is more efficient than crystalline silicon for some energy range. You see, this green is the absorption coefficient for amorphous silicon and this blue is for crystalline silicon. In this energy range, maybe around from 1.7 to 3.5, amorphous silicon is more efficiently absorbing the sunlight than crystalline silicon. That means for a given layer thickness, the amorphous silicon will absorb more sunlight than a crystalline silicon for a given thickness. So what happens when you incorporate a p amorphous silicon? It seems that the p amorphous silicon layer, even if it is very thin, maybe of the order of 10 nanometer, it is absorbing a large amount of incident light, thereby the light will otherwise go to your crystalline silicon and will create electron hole pairs. But now these lights are lost in absorption within your p amorphous silicon. So your efficiency is less. So if you see this plot now, the thickness of the p amorphous silicon is plotted in the x-axis, and in this third figure, the short circuit current that we get from your solar cell is plotted in the y-axis. So this figure shows you the variation in the short circuit current as a function of the p amorphous silicon thickness. Because of the loss in the absorption inside your p amorphous silicon layer, clearly the short circuit current is reducing as you increase your p amorphous silicon thickness. So there is really a transparency issue with this amorphous silicon. But it seems it is not the only thing that is hampering its efficiency. Why? Because if you see, the transparency issue actually affects the short circuit current, but what is the factor that is affecting its VOC? VOC is very less. So it is not only the transparency of the amorphous silicon, but there is some other factor that is affecting its open circuit voltage. What could be the other factor that is degrading the performance of this kind of solar cell? Let us see. Then researchers have found out that because of the high doping of this amorphous silicon is a very inefficient passivation layer for the crystalline silicon dangling bonds. So we are losing on the passivation quality here. So because this amorphous silicon is highly doped, there is large number of defect states within the p amorphous silicon, and it is not able to passivate the dangling bonds present at the crystalline silicon surface. And that is why your efficiency is so low. So what to do? Now we have seen that this amorphous silicon could be a suitable candidate for heterojunction, but if you deposit P amorphous silicon on top of N crystalline silicon, it is giving you bad solar cells instead of a good one. But researchers have found out a very nice idea to overcome this limitation. What they did, they inserted a very thin intrinsic amorphous silicon in between the p-doped amorphous silicon and crystalline silicon. So now, instead of having a direct contact between this highly doped layer and N crystalline silicon, you are having an intrinsic amorphous silicon. So being intrinsic or undoped, it is having significant order of less defect density compared to its doped amorphous silicon. And this intrinsic amorphous silicon has proven to be an excellent passivation layer for the passivation of the dangling bonds at the crystalline silicon surface. Once they have incorporated this intrinsic amorphous silicon, there's a huge boost in efficiency. You can see the efficiency has gone from 12% in the previous case to more than 15% here. Just by insertion of a very thin intrinsic amorphous silicon, the overall efficiency rises to more than 15%. And this efficiency benefit comes from the increase in the open circuit voltage as desired in a heterojunction solar cell. So this figure shows you a cross-sectional TEM image, transmission electron microscopic image of a crystalline silicon and amorphous silicon interface. This is the crystalline silicon where you can see the nicely arranged periodic pattern of the silicon atoms, and this is amorphous silicon, and because of their amorphous nature, the image is blurred here. You cannot identify the exact position of the silicon atoms. Now, in order to get a good passivation by this amorphous layer through the dangling bonds, you need two things. One is a very good electronic property of this amorphous silicon film away from the interface. That means this amorphous silicon should have as low as defect density possible. As low defect density as possible inside your amorphous silicon film. What about this junction? You have to have an abrupt interface between this amorphous silicon and crystalline silicon. What I mean by abrupt interface is that whenever you try to deposit amorphous silicon by PECVD, there is a tendency of the silicon atoms that are coming from the plasma to sit exactly on the top of your crystalline silicon atom's position, thereby creating a epitaxial layer on top of your crystalline silicon. Now, most of the time, you can see such epitaxial layer at this figure, where this is amorphous silicon, but there is some kind of periodic arrangement of crystalline silicon that can be seen here, right? This kind of defective mixed phase epitaxy is very much detrimental or degrading in terms of device performance, because this kind of defective epitaxy is not able to passivate the surface dangling bonds. That means again you are losing on your VOC. Another disadvantage of this epitaxy is that anyway you are forming again a crystalline silicon on top of your crystalline silicon. So there is no heterojunction exist. If you are having epitaxy at the interface, At this point, it is a junction between a crystalline silicon with a crystalline silicon. So the advantage of introducing a heterojunction is missing. So what we look for? We look for a abrupt amorphous silicon crystalline silicon interface. So in the left hand side is the image that I have shown you in the previous slide, and the right hand side image shows you an abrupt interface. Here you can see the junction at the crystalline silicon amorphous silicon junction. There is not that much epitaxy that have taken place compared to this figure, right? So such kind of junction is called abrupt junction, and this is the kind of junction you will look for in your crystalline silicon hetero interface. Now people have moved further. They started with insertion of an intrinsic amorphous silicon at the top of crystalline silicon in one side. But presently what we have is we have the amorphous silicon on both sides of your crystalline silicon. That means the crystalline silicon wafer is passivated in both sides by intrinsic amorphous silicon. And you are having heterojunction on the both sides as well. So initially you are having heterojunction only to collect the holes, and there is no heterojunction to collect electrons here. But here in double heterojunction structure, you are having not only having your intrinsic passivation in both sides. This yellow figure or yellow color layer shows you the intrinsic amorphous silicon passivation layer. And on the top of it, you are having a P plus amorphous silicon dope layer. This is the P plus amorphous silicon dope layer in pink. That is one heterojunction. And in the bottom side, you are having a N plus amorphous silicon in green. So you are having double heterojunction. And this structure finally gave efficiency as high as 20%. Okay. So nicely, the intrinsic amorphous silicon and use of the heterojunction has given us a nice efficiency. But if you think, there still remains a question. I have told you that this intrinsic silicon is not doped, right? It is a undoped amorphous silicon. But we have discussed several times that in order for a good transport of carriers across the heterojunction, you have to have high conductivity of your carrier transport layer. Then is not that the presence of this intrinsic amorphous silicon is going to affect the charge transport across this interface? It should affect, right? Because instead of doped P amorphous silicon, you are having intrinsic amorphous silicon in between the dope layer, and the conductivity of this intrinsic amorphous silicon could be several orders of magnitude lower than its doped amorphous silicon. So we should definitely lose something in terms of proper collection or proper transport of charge carriers across this junction. Is it right? Let us see. So the answer can be found if you see the overall band diagram of a double heterojunction silicon solar cell of this kind. See, this buffer layer is actually your intrinsic amorphous silicon. Because of the presence of a very thin amorphous silicon, very thin intrinsic amorphous silicon, it is actually not preventing your charge carrier transport, because you are having charge carrier transport either by tunneling or by thermionic emission. But you have to be very careful that the thickness of your intrinsic amorphous silicon is not much, because if the thickness is high, then you are preventing the tunneling of the charge carriers, right, across the intrinsic silicon. So in short, if you are incorporating very thin intrinsic amorphous silicon, it will not going to affect your charge carrier much, but you will get a boost in your efficiency because of the excellent surface passivation offered by this intrinsic amorphous silicon layer. Okay, now what about the electron transport? This electron, because of the high barrier it sees while moving from this point to P side, it will go downhill and it will go diffuse towards this N plus amorphous silicon. And here it sees a very small conduction band offset, and it will eventually get collected to this N plus amorphous silicon layer and get transported to the external metal contact. So in order to have a nice transport of electrons from the conduction band of N crystalline silicon to your amorphous silicon, you have to dope this amorphous silicon to a high level. You have to make a N plus amorphous silicon. Okay, now there is always scope for improvement. So researchers are finding out what are the other improvements they can incorporate inside your silicon heterojunction, because now the efficiency is fixed around 21%, but the Shockley-Queisel limit for a silicon solar cell is more than 30%. So where is the losses that you can reduce? So if you look closely, in crystalline silicon, what you are having at the front side, you are having some metal finger contacts. These are the metal fingers to collect the charge carriers from your semiconductor to the outside circuit. So now there involves a design to choose the geometry of these metal fingers, because if you place these metal fingers quite away, that means the distance between two metal fingers is high, then what will happen? The charge carrier have to flow laterally longer distances. And when they are flowing longer distances, there is always a chance that they will recombine, because now they are staying for longer inside your semiconductor. So you can't place the fingers much further to each other. So let us put the finger closer. But if you put the finger closer, what will happen? The amount of sunlight that is coming from this front side and entering into your absorber layer will be reflected back from the front side. Why? Because the metals are known to be a very good reflector of sunlight. If the density of such fingers is high at the front side, it is invariably going to reflect most of the light away from your solar cell. So the amount of light available for this absorber layer to absorb becomes less, right? So what is the way out? Engineers have designed the optimum finger distance and their size in order to minimize this shading loss, in order to minimize the loss of light that is getting reflected from these metal contacts. But is it possible that we remove the entire front contact, and collect both the electrons and holes from the back side? See, it is very important. What I am now talking about is that I am talking about removing these front contacts completely from the front side and collecting the electrons and holes both from the back contact only. Is it possible? So apparently it seems to contradict what we have discussed in our last session. I mentioned that in order to get a meaningful charge current at your external circuit, what you need to do is you have to make sure that your photogenerated electrons are traveling in one direction. Excuse me. And the photogenerated holes are traveling on the other direction. But if we remove the front contacts and collecting both the electrons and holes from the back side, are these solar cells going to work? Because now your electrons and holes are traveling in the same direction. The answer is surprisingly yes. It is entirely possible, it is absolutely possible to make a solar cell where there is no metal contact at the front side and you are collecting both the electrons and holes from the back side of your crystalline silicon absorber. And it is not at all in contradiction with this picture of collecting electrons and holes separately, because at the back side there is a separate arrangement made to collect the electrons and holes separately. Here, this N-amorphous silicon forms a electron collecting layer. So the electrons that are near to this contact will get collected through this contact, and this P-amorphous silicon are forming your hole collecting layer. That means the holes that are diffusing towards this junction will get collected through this contact. So these interdigitated pattern of alternative P and N contact is actually facilitating the requirement to separate the electron hole collection. Okay. So this kind of technology is called back contacted solar cell technology. And this is not only possible, but this is the solar cell that holds the current record efficiency. Is not it quite surprising, right? Sorry. So now let us see, if we are talking about back contact solar cell, what is the driving force here? What is the force that is driving the electrons or holes towards the respective contact? We have talked about this driving force yesterday. We have seen in a homojunction, the presence of this built-in potential at the junction between N-type crystalline silicon and P-type crystalline silicon is the driving force in separating out the electrons and holes. But here there is no junction. There is no junction in the front. There is the junction only present in the back side. So how the electrons are or holes are going to travel across this junction and gets collected? The answer is that it is a combination of some important factors that are facilitating the efficient electron and hole collection. So let us talk about one by one about these factors. In order to make an interdigitated back contact solar cell, where there is no front metal electrode, you have to use a very high quality silicon wafer that will give you a high lifetime of your minority carriers. That means if the lifetime of the photogenerated carriers are high, they will get more time to diffuse from this side towards the respective contact, right? For example, if an electron hole pair is generated at the middle of this absorber layer for a certain wavelength, and if the lifetime of the minority carrier is high, there is always a fair amount of possibility that these minority carriers will travel or will diffuse towards the backside before they recombine, right? And the next important requirement is the excellent passivation of the surface and the good heterojunction property, because now your electrons and holes are traveling by diffusion towards this contact, and if you are losing holes by recombination at this N-type transport layer, you are losing in efficiency. So what you have to ensure is that the electrons that are coming close to this, okay, let us talk about electrons. The electrons that are coming close to this P layer or P transport layer or the hole transport layer, you have to make sure these are not recombining with the defect states. So you have to make the electrons to keep on diffusing so that once they come closer to its electron contact, it will get selected, right? And another requirement is the use of a very thin crystalline silicon wafer. How the use of thin wafer going to help? To answer this question, let me define the diffusion length of a carrier. A diffusion length of a carrier is the average length that a photogenerated carrier travels before it recombines. And it can be calculated from this simple equation, which is the square root of the diffusivity of the carrier and the lifetime. Clearly, if the lifetime of your carrier is high, the longer the distance the carrier will travel before they will recombine. So for high lifetime, you are going to have high diffusion length. What about this diffusivity? Diffusivity is a constant or the diffusion coefficient, and it depends on the doping or the mobility of your material. So for a fixed doping concentration crystalline silicon wafer, the diffusivity is fixed. Now, if you are choosing very high quality lifetime wafer, this lifetime is high, therefore you are getting high diffusion length of your minority carriers across this device. So let us take an example. If for my crystalline silicon wafer, the diffusivity is 14 centimeter square per second, and my minority carrier lifetime inside the bulk is bad, that is 10 microsecond, then it gives the diffusion length of around 119 micrometer only. That means the electrons will travel, or electrons or holes or the minority carriers will travel only 119 micrometer before they will get recombined and lost. Now, if you can improve on your minority carrier lifetime of your crystalline silicon wafer to 500 microsecond, your diffusion length increases to 840 micron. That means now your carriers are diffusing longer distances before they are recombining. Even further, if you manage to get a lifetime of 1 millisecond inside your wafer, for the same diffusivity, now your minority carrier diffusion length is quite high. It is around 1183 micrometer. Now see what happens if your wafer thickness is 180 micron only, or if you are using 180 micron crystalline silicon absorber and your wafer quality is good, the photogenerated electrons and holes are going to stay inside this absorber layer. Because their diffusion length is high now, they will keep on diffusing, and once they reach their respective contacts, they will get collected. So this is how a choice of a thinner wafer helps in this kind of back contacted silicon solar cell. And okay, so this kind of back contact solar cell giving you highest efficiency, and the efficiency is quite high. It is around 26%. But it is a very sophisticated technology, because as you can see, you are using a very expensive high quality crystalline silicon wafer. You have to separately, you have to mask the back contact. You have to create an optimized interdigitated pattern for an optimized carrier collection. So it is a very sophisticated technology. So again, there is a scope for alternatives, because our goal should be to get high efficiency but at a much lower cost. This particular back contact technology suffers in terms of high wafer cost and increased fabrication step, because you are fabricating intrinsic layer in one time. Sorry. Then you have to deposit a p-doped amorphous silicon. Then you have to deposit n-type amorphous silicon along with the intrinsic passivation on top of your N-side. So this technology actually increases the fabrication step, thereby to some extent the fabrication cost. Now there is a scope for improvement. The obvious question that arises is that, can a single material work as both passivation layer and carrier selective layer? What I am saying here is that instead of separately using intrinsic amorphous silicon as a passivation layer and a p-doped amorphous silicon as a conducting layer, is it possible that you are using a single material and that material is doing both of your job? This material is passivating the crystalline silicon wafer, and at the same time it is working as a good carrier selective layer. As we have seen earlier, it is not possible using amorphous silicon, because the high defect density inside the amorphous silicon is dictating the interface passivation quality. Is there any other material than amorphous silicon that can do this job? The answer is yes. And that is where the metal oxides comes into picture in the crystalline silicon heterojunction technology. Use of such metal oxide is very popular in organic solar cells or perovskite solar cells. It is also nowadays popular in crystalline silicon technology as well. So there are many metal oxides such as titanium dioxide, magnesium oxide that can work as electron selective and hole blocking layer. That means because of their low work function and high band gap, let us see an example of a heterojunction between titanium oxide and in crystalline silicon. This titanium oxide, being an oxide, is having high band gap. The band gap is around greater than 3 electron volt, and the conduction band offset that it offers at the interface is much less, right? So the electrons can easily travel through this conduction band offset and will get collected to the metal. So it is a electron selective layer for in crystalline silicon. What happens to the holes? The holes that are diffusing towards this TiOX in crystalline silicon junction sees a huge valence band offset, right? So it is very less probability that this hole will cross this barrier. Similarly, there are metal oxide like vanadium pentoxide, nickel oxide, molybdenum oxide, tungsten oxide that can work as hole selective and electron blocking layer. Let us take an example for nickel oxide and P-type crystalline silicon. Here, the valence band of the nickel oxide aligns well with the valence band of the crystalline silicon. So, the hole that is now traveling from this P-crystalline silicon to the metal sees a very less potential barrier. But the electrons that wants to travel in this direction sees a huge conduction band offset, right? So it is almost impossible for this electron to overcome this barrier unless they are tunneling through this layer, right? And what about the passivation quality of this metal oxide? Actually, as long as the metal oxide are amorphous, their passivation quality is excellent. Why I am saying this? Because you will see the material, more amorphous is the material, it is easier for the material to passivate the dangling bonds. Why? Because if you see in the surface, because of the crystalline nature of the silicon, the atom positions are fixed, right? Even if there is a missing silicon atom at the surface, but just below the surface, the position of the silicon atom is fixed. And if you want to make a covalent bond with this lone pair electron or with this surface silicon, what you have to do, you have to put an atom exactly on top of the silicon, and this atom should follow the periodicity of the surface silicon, because the periodicity of the surface silicon is quite rigid, or the position of the silicon is quite rigid inside the crystalline silicon. The advantage of using amorphous material here is that they can relax their structure, because now there is no bound for them to sit on a particular fixed lattice site, right? So whenever you are using amorphous oxides or amorphous material, there is a fair amount of possibility that these are going to passivate the dangling bonds. Because if they are sitting exactly on top of the crystalline silicon and these atoms are coming from a crystalline material, then these atoms that you are using to passivate the crystalline silicon surface bonds, if they are crystalline, they are having a certain periodic arrangement, and which is different from the arrangement of the crystalline silicon, and their mismatch between their periodic arrangement will create a strain in these surface atoms or in these surface bonds, and making this bond vulnerable to break. And once this bond interface surface bond breaks, they become again as a electrically active trapping site. So, in short, amorphous materials are always helpful in good passivation because they can relax their structure. So these metal oxides, being oxide and amorphous, are very much useful in passivation, but you have to make sure that these metal oxides are amorphous in nature. Now, if these metal oxides are amorphous, how they are going to provide good conductivity? Because they are in crystalline material, usually because of their high mobility, the conductivity of the crystalline material is higher in terms of carrier collection compared to its amorphous counterpart. Now, if I am incorporating metal oxide to form heterojunction and I have to passivate the silicon surface well, so I have to use the amorphous form of the metal oxide, then how this is going to help in conductivity? The beautiful property that a metal oxide provides is their intrinsic doping effect. That means even if they are not doped, because of the presence of defects, be it a metal defect or oxygen vacancy defect, they conduct to some extent. And if the thickness of this metal oxide is less, the electrons or the holes can nicely tunnel through the defect states present at this interface. So let us take another example. In this particular example, the p-doped amorphous silicon is replaced by hole selective molybdenum oxide or tungsten oxide. And this structure actually retains this amorphous intrinsic amorphous silicon as a passivation layer, because it is, in reality, it is actually very difficult to replace this amorphous silicon because it provides excellent passivation of the crystalline silicon surface. So let us keep this amorphous silicon, intrinsic amorphous silicon, and replace the p-type amorphous silicon by this molybdenum oxide and tungsten oxide or tungsten oxide. So let us now look at the band diagram. Unlike to the previous case, where we have seen that the nickel oxide is working as a hole transport layer, and there is a valence band alignment between this nickel oxide and the crystalline silicon. Here what happens? The molybdenum oxide and tungsten oxide or tungsten oxide is actually n-type in nature. And because of their high work function difference between the crystalline silicon and this n-type tungsten oxide, for example, there is a inversion layer present at the interface. And because of this presence of inversion layer, now the valence band of the p-silicon, valence band of your crystalline silicon gets aligned with the conduction band of your metal oxide. Okay, so this is different from nickel oxide case. I am repeating this because in nickel oxide silicon heterojunction, there is a alignment between the valence band. Now here, because of this induced p++ inversion layer, as we have seen in case of p amorphous silicon and crystalline silicon, here the valence band edge and the conduction band edge of the metal oxide aligns. Once you have this kind of alignment, now these holes can nicely travel from the valence band of crystalline silicon to the conduction band of the metal oxide and gets collected. So this is how the metal oxide carrier selective layers are benefiting the silicon heterojunction technology. People have already reported high efficiency using such structure. The efficiency is around 20%. And let us see these two curves. This is the current voltage characteristics obtained from this heterojunction solar cell, where they have used molybdenum oxide as a replacement of the p-doped crystalline amorphous silicon. This molybdenum oxide is actually collecting holes from the front side. So depending on the molybdenum oxide property, whether it is more defective or it is good electronic property, you are getting difference in the efficiency. If the property of the molybdenum oxide is good, you are getting efficiency around 20%, which is given by this black IV characteristics. But if your molybdenum oxide properties are not good, it is defective, then the efficiency reduces to 17%. So there is a scope that you can improve on the properties of the molybdenum oxide and improve the efficiency. So this ends my talk. In summary, during these two lectures, we have seen the heterojunction technology is not only an excellent candidate for solar cell, but you can apply this technology for any kind of optoelectronic devices because it has the inherent property of carrier selectivity. Then we have seen that the understanding of the energy band alignment at the interface between your absorber layer and the charge transport layer is very important. And finally, in order to have a nicely working silicon or nicely working solar cell, you have to optimize individual layers to get the improved device performance. And this is true for any kind of solar cell. Thank you for your attention, and you can ask me any question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mondal. So now you can ask any questions to Dr. Mondal. If you have any questions, please ask him. Yeah, you can ask directly to him.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Mondal. It was a very nice and informative session, especially on heterojunction solar cells. I am just curious to know what is the future of these heterojunction solar cells into the marketplace. Because as we understand from your talk, there had been quite a lot of development in terms of improving the device efficiency, VOC, fill factor and everything by replacing the intrinsic amorphous silicon. So how are we going to see these solar cells is the one question, because as you understand, solar cell, particularly amorphous silicon solar cells, have taken off a bit, in 10 years before, but now it has declined again. So again, I understand because of the efficiency criteria. So how are you very positive in this aspect?
Yeah, so actually it is a nice question. Thank you for asking. Now, if we talk about the industry applicability of this kind of solar cell, let me tell you that this heterojunction in back contact heterojunction solar cell, can you see my screen? Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We can see.
Okay. So this is
yes, ma'am. I can see.
Okay. So maybe now I think I am audible.
Yes, ma'am. You are audible.
Okay. So see, this back contact silicon heterojunction solar cell is already in market, and people are making high efficiency module. So this efficiency is for a single solar cell at the laboratory scale. But the beauty of having a silicon solar cell is that once you make a module out of this single solar cells by actually connecting many solar cells in series or in parallel, this module efficiency is quite close to the single junction or close to the single solar cell efficiency. So the module efficiency using this back contact solar cell, I believe, is more than 23%, and these are available in the market. Again, this is advantage of silicon solar cell, I will say, because the gap between the module efficiency and a laboratory scale single solar cell efficiency is as low as possible in this case of silicon. But if you compare this with other material, for example, perovskite, for example, other thin film technologies such as cadmium sulfide, CIGS, in those cases, what happens? If you get high efficiency in a single solar cell, and now you are making a module out of it, then the gap between the maximum module efficiency and the single solar cell efficiency is huge. So it is one of the advantage, and I think replacing this technology will take a longer time. Replacing this technology by other kind of technology, by other materials, will take longer time because of these aspects. And already the industry is well set to make a silicon solar cell, because our semiconductor industry is dominated by fabrication of metal oxide semiconductor transistors, right? And same laboratory or same industry you can use to make a crystalline silicon solar cell. That is why it is so fast that this crystalline silicon solar cell technology has developed. And I agree that there are scopes for improvement, there are scopes for other materials, there are very promising materials available, but the time it will take for these material to replace crystalline silicon technology is, I think, high. Maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Am I audible, madam?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mandal. It's a very nice presentation, and overall, I get a very good idea about the solar cell and the recent research advancement in the research. Very nice presentation. So, can I get a 5 to 10 minutes? Actually, can the coordinator can allow me to take some minutes? Okay, so can you please, madam, go to the slide number 27, I think 27, where it is, you have you told that regarding the diffusion length of the magnetic area.
Okay.
I think that is 37 or 27.
37 probably.
Yes,
Yeah.
37, I think. Yes. So okay. So I think I'm a little bit curious about that. That is, if I want to measure the diffusion length for the majority carrier, then what will be the equation? And second thing is that why the magnetic carrier diffusion length is important for this kind for the solar cell. Even though you also know for the diode also and even for the BJT, the bipolar junction transistors.
Right.
So the magnetic carrier lifetime or diffusion length is very much important. So why, if I want to my first question is, if I want to measure the majority carrier diffusion length, and then what would be the thing, and why the minority carrier diffusion length is important for this kind of devices?
Okay, very nice question. I would say because if I want to answer your question, I will introduce a term called dielectric relaxation time.
Yes.
So why your minority carrier lifetime or diffusion length is important, because I have if you were present in the previous talk, I have shown. Let me see show this again. Probably this one. Yeah. So yesterday's talk, we have seen that the recombination event is limited by the minority carriers.
Okay.
Just 1 minute. Yeah. So you can see in the left hand side image that this is a N-type semiconductor. I can tell this by looking at the number of electrons in the conduction band, sorry, and the number of holes in the valence band. So clearly, if your minority carrier number is less, once you were run out of your minority carriers, there is no recombination event happening, right? If all the minority carriers are gone, because of this recombination with electrons.
Hmm.
So then once all the holes are gone after recombining with electron, there is no possibility of these electrons or the no energy level available for the electron to go and sit, right? So
Okay.
the recombination is indeed limited by the less abundant carriers. That means the minority carriers. In this case, it is the number of holes.
Okay.
This is the intuitive way you can understand it. Now, the very important question that comes, why the lifetime of majority carriers are not important,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, see, for majority carriers, what happens for minority carriers? Minority carriers are minority carriers because they are in a region inside your semiconductor where their number is less, right?
Hmm.
Number is less, their mobility is less.
Hmm.
So the conductivity of the minority carrier inside a semiconductor, for example, if we are talking about N-type semiconductor, the conductivity of holes inside a N-type semiconductor, it will be much, much lesser than the conductivity of electrons. Agree?
Hmm.
Now, what happens? The way a majority carrier travels across the semiconductor, in this case the electrons,
Hmm.
this phenomena is called, you can understand this by if you read about the dielectric relaxation.
Yes.
Because of their high mobility and high density of carriers present, actually, if you really see the how long an electron lives inside the N-type silicon, actually their lifetime is much, much lesser than the minority carrier lifetime. Okay.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is that if you are having 1 millisecond of minority carrier lifetime inside your N-type semiconductor,
Hmm.
the majority carrier lifetime will be much, much lesser than 1 millisecond. So
Yes.
it,
Exactly.
yeah, so it is not about the lifetime because there are a huge number of carriers present. Their mobility is much high. So the overall conductivity that they will give will be higher compared to your minority carrier conductivity. One.
Exactly.
So this is how I will answer your question.
Okay. Then how can I measure the majority carrier lifetime?
It is actually not important, you know. If you want to, just 1 minute. Yeah. So it is not very important because it is not an important parameter for to calculate the majority carrier lifetime, because it is the conductivity or the concentration or the mobility that is important for a majority carrier to give you a good charge transport. And those properties you can probe by simple IV measurements or temperature dependent IV measurements and all that.
No, I just little bit to clear that thing, that how the dielectric relaxation time is, govern the minority carrier lifetime.
No, no, no. It is not the minority carrier lifetime. It is governing the majority carrier lifetime.
Okay.
It is
Okay.
not governing the lifetime.
Then,
Please,
yes. Yes.
I will suggest a small correction
Yes.
in your statement.
Okay.
The dielectric relaxation is not governing your lifetime. It is deciding the way a majority carrier flows inside your semiconductor.
So that may be drift and diffusion.
No, no. So for this, you have to read about dielectric carrier relaxation or
Yes.
dielectric
Yes.
relaxation. So you will get into know. This is an involved topic, and you can get a fairly good amount of idea of it. It is not a difficult one, but I will suggest you to see what is
Okay.
dielectric relaxation.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. My second question is,
Huh.
yes. I got the point. Hello.
Huh.
Yes. My second question is, what is the maximum open circuit voltage of your heterostructure? That is the last heterostructure you have shown.
Okay.
So what is the maximum open circuit voltage?
So you are talking about heterojunction between transition metal oxide and
Yes,
crystalline silicon?
exactly.
Okay.
TMO
So, okay, so let me admit that this IV curve is quite old now. It is, I believe it is from a paper in the year 2020.
Okay.
So at that time, the VOC is around 699 millivolt
Millivolt.
for
Okay.
a good quality quality metal oxide crystalline
The
silicon.
maximum voltage. Yes,
Yes, open circuit voltage. Yeah.
Okay. I'm a little bit curious about your structure. Is this a kind of zigzag structure?
Sorry.
So is what I am seeing from this schematic is that there are kind of zigzag type.
Yeah.
So have you etched that kind of things?
Yeah. Exactly.
Etching
So yeah. So actually, I intentionally omitted this texturization part from my entire talk because it will otherwise take another 1 hour. So in short, this is indeed the etched crystalline silicon surface. So this etching is performed in order to produce periodical texture in micro scale at the top of your crystalline silicon wafer. So this will improve your path length of the light when the light enters the crystalline silicon. So once the path length of the light is improved, then you are having more probability that this light will get absorbed, right? So what you do, you first etch the crystalline silicon to form this pyramidal texture. Then you deposit your other layers on the top of this texturization. So this will help you in improvement in current.
I mean, it's generally etched by KOH. Is that etched by KOH?
Yeah. You can etch by KOH. You can use NaOH. It's called as a wet chemical etching of crystalline silicon.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Next question is what is the spectral absorption range for this kind of structure?
Spectral absorbance range for this kind of structure. Okay,
Yes.
so you can answer this by yourself, I believe, because if you see this metal oxide, in case it is molybdenum oxide, it is having band gap greater than 3 electron volt. So it is not going to absorb any visible part.
Okay.
So the active absorption spectral range.
IR part, IR or UV.
Exactly. So no, yeah, the active part for this metal oxide will be in UV, but
Okay, only UV.
it leaves the active part of your absorption in the crystalline silicon, and which is determined by the absorption coefficient of your crystalline silicon, as I have shown, I believe, 1 minute. Yeah. See, now given your transition metal oxides are not absorbing much light, now it is determined by the crystalline silicon band edge. As you can see here, the
So
crystalline
it is around 300 to 600 nanometer.
No, it is from 300 to 1100 nanometer for crystalline silicon. Even if the absorption coefficient is less, but you are having a certain thickness, right? So now, because of the thickness, and even if the absorption coefficient is less, there is a probability that these high wavelength photons will also get absorbed inside your crystalline silicon.
Okay. So regarding this crystalline and amorphous, I have question. So for amorphous, let's start with the amorphous first. So in case of amorphous, we know that if we increase the temperature, there is a change in the, change in the structure. So, so that means the watt loss per degree Celsius is also high. So how can you, circumvent that problem?
Yeah, actually, this is very tricky to do, because actually I have worked in this kind of amorphous silicon, crystalline silicon heterojunction, and it is very tricky to build a good solar cell. If you have experience in this field, then you can do it. Why I'm saying this? Because this amorphous silicon is deposited usually by CVD method, as I have mentioned.
Exactly.
And there are several parameters that you can control in a
So
CVD.
sorry to interrupt you. This probably PCVD is the most, popular technique for this kind of deposition.
Yeah,
I think.
but there are hot wire CVD as well. So actually, I used hot wire CVD to deposit amorphous silicon. So what happens? There are many parameters that you can control: the temperature of the substrate, the gas pressure, the secondary reactions of the gas present inside your vacuum chamber, and all that. So what happens, if you remember, I talked about the requirement of having a abrupt crystalline silicon amorphous silicon interface.
Yes.
What happens if your substrate temperature is high? I mean, substrate temperature means the substrate over which you are going to deposit amorphous silicon.
Exactly.
If the substrate temperature is high, in this case, it is the crystalline silicon over which you are aiming to deposit amorphous silicon. If you
Exactly.
keep the crystalline silicon at high temperature, what will happen? The precursors or the species, the silicon containing species that are coming towards the substrate will have high thermal energy. Then what will happen?
What?
They
What?
can
Just can't get you.
high thermal energy.
Okay. Okay.
Because of the high temperature of the substrate. Now these silicon containing species can hop from one point to another before they find a good point to sit in terms of their minimizing their total energy, right? And
Okay.
this high substrate temperature therefore leads to the formation of epitaxy at the interface. Because now your silicon atom can travel across a certain distance on the top of your crystalline silicon to find out the minimum energy position. And
Exactly.
obviously, the minimum energy position is the crystalline silicon arrangement.
Yes. That's the stability of the structure. So that is all about the epitaxy or the growth of this amorphous silicon and the silicon substrate. But I'm talking about
No. It is also about, right. You are right. It is also about the property of the amorphous silicon material as well.
exactly. So now I'm talking about the if I expose that amorphous material, the solar energy. So that means we are increasing the temperature. I mean, they are defined. That maybe defined temperatures are there. So if I correlate that thing with the watt loss per degree Celsius. So in case of amorphous material, it is very often observed that the watt loss per degree Celsius is very high due to the change in temperature when it is exposed.
Right.
So how can you circumvent that problem? So that is why that is the thing I am asking.
Yeah, I got your question. So your question is leaning to more towards amorphous silicon thin film solar cell.
Exactly.
Why I am saying this? Because in amorphous silicon thin film solar cell, it is the amorphous silicon intrinsic absorber layer that you use in place of crystalline silicon. So what happens if you expose amorphous silicon thin film solar cell to sunlight? There is a degradation that happens with time inside your amorphous silicon that is called Stabler-Wronski effect.
Okay.
It is associated with the mobility of the hydrogen bond across your amorphous silicon.
Okay.
What happens when light shines on it? Because of the heat or because of the internal dynamics that is happening inside your amorphous silicon, these hydrogen that are passivating the crystalline silicon, if you can see my screen.
Exactly, I
these
can see.
Hydrogen that are passivating the silicon dangling bonds can now move across your silicon structure, and even for higher temperature, these hydrogen will break this bond and diffuse away or go away from your crystalline silicon, amorphous silicon material.
Okay.
This particular effect is called the light-induced degradation. If you Google it, you will find the topic is the light-induced degradation in amorphous silicon. It is first observed by scientists named Stabler and Wronski. And I have the opportunity to work with my supervisor who has a direct experience to work with that Wronski group. So it is indeed a difficult thing to handle in amorphous silicon technology, and that is why this technology left out. But there is a possibility, and that's how most of the amorphous silicon thin film is made, is by making a PIN structure. So what happens in thin film amorphous silicon? You are having intrinsic amorphous silicon. You are having a p-doped amorphous silicon in one side and n-doped amorphous silicon on the other side. So because of this PIN structure, now because of the presence of this intrinsic amorphous silicon, you are having some electric field across the thickness of your amorphous silicon.
Exactly.
And this electric field somehow helps in the rearrangement of hydrogen, and the rearrangement is not like affecting your performance, but it is helping the thin film amorphous silicon to or prevent the amorphous silicon film to degrade because of the light exposure.
Yes, if I explain this in this way, that the intrinsic layer is kind of a buffer layer, so it will actually give you the constant electric field, and which will just kind of whatever the generation of electron is there, that will be transported to the electrode. So that's the kind of buffer layer, as I think so.
Yeah, so it is a buffer layer in sense it is the absorber layer also. This intrinsic amorphous silicon.
Yes, it is also absorber layer, exactly, because with a continuous electric field is there.
So why it is intrinsic? Because if you use a dope amorphous silicon for absorbing the light, then because of its dope nature, the width of the depletion region will be less, right?
Exactly.
But if you use an intrinsic amorphous silicon, the width of the depletion region could extend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So thing is that, so in this schematic, the intrinsic layer should be the width of the intrinsic layer should be the higher than that of P and N, because as it is the absorber layer.
No. Now you were talking about thin film amorphous silicon or this particular?
No, this particular picture. Yes.
Okay, it is crystalline silicon amorphous silicon heterojunction. Yeah.
Yes. So the intrinsic region, the width of the intrinsic region should be higher than that of P and N because it is the absorber layer.
No. Here, intrinsic amorphous silicon is not the absorber layer. Here, your crystalline silicon is the absorber layer, and the role of this intrinsic layer is just to passivate the dangling bonds of your crystalline silicon.
Just so kind of tailoring.
Exactly. This technology is quite different from amorphous silicon technology. Here, this use of this intrinsic silicon is not to absorb sunlight, but to passivate the dangling bonds. So you have to aim for a very thin intrinsic amorphous silicon layer. Very thin. Otherwise, there will be loss of light absorption within this layer.
It's very nice, good to know that thing, because we have already the conventional technique is that intrinsic layer is used to absorber, so that's the kind of PIN diode.
Right.
So we just increasing the I part, intrinsic part, so for the absorption, more amount of light absorption. Right. Okay, that's very kind of good technology. Just last question, 1 minute. That is the what kind of crystallinity in this structure? That is monocrystalline or polycrystalline kind of thing you are saying?
Crystalline silicon?
Yes.
Preferably, it is monocrystalline silicon with diamond cubic.
You have developed it. I mean, you have
the record efficiency. Yeah, the record efficiency is held by monocrystalline silicon, but it is possible if you use a polycrystalline silicon to make.
Because polycrystalline silicon, as per I know, that is the efficiency decreased. Yeah,
because of the presence of defects, right? Yes. There is a huge number of grain boundaries.
Exactly, the fringe defects are there. Edge defects, pencil defects, lots of defects.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, madam, for your time.
Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. Is there any other question from any other participants?
Excuse me, I have a question, please. And as you described that in homo junction structure, we have to need a barrier, like as in heterojunction structure, we have a barrier to stop electrons and holes to recombine to reduce the recombination loss. Is there any possibility that we introduce another layer, like defect layer in homo junction structure to control this? I think so. Okay, in homo junction structure, the crystal lattice constant, which matters a lot in flow of electron holes. Is there any possibility that we introduce a defect layers in homo junction structure to create a barrier so that we can handle recombination loss and other things using the crystal lattice of that layers?
Okay, so if you see, if you are talking about introducing another material in your homo junction structure to reduce the defect states, right? So it is eventually the heterojunction, right? Because you are talking about introducing another material on top of your crystalline silicon. As soon as you introduce another material, as it is done in heterojunction, where you have crystalline silicon, and exactly what you said, this is the motivation of making a silicon heterojunction. So if it has not done, you could have made it, because you have got the point. The point is that you have to reduce the defect states at the surface. So in order to reduce the defect states, you incorporate another material on top of your crystalline silicon wafer. This makes the heterojunction. So if you introduce same material to your crystalline silicon homojunction, this structure no longer belongs to homojunction family. It becomes a heterojunction. So have I answered your question?
Yes, miss. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to give you one information. Mr. Hamid, he is from our neighboring country. So thank you, Hamid, for joining our course. So thank you. Is there any other question from any other participants, please? Yeah, I think there are no more questions.
Yeah.
So we are already completed this program, this page. Today's session, morning session now.